My name is Booker Whitfield, and I'm a lumberjack who survived the first 30 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted on June 15, 2025, it threw the world into an endless winter that killed billions. I was alone in the Oregon wilderness when summer turned to winter overnight. For 30 days, I fought starvation, sub-zero temperatures, and complete isolation while desperately trying to survive long enough to reach my 2 children in Portland. This is my story of how I stayed alive when civilization collapsed around me. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Booker Whitfield, and 34 days ago, I was just another lumberjack working the Oregon forests near Mount Hood. Today, I'm one of the few people left alive after Yellowstone erupted and threw our planet into an ice age that happened faster than anyone thought possible. What I'm about to tell you isn't just my story of survival. It's a warning about how quickly everything you know can disappear, and how the skills that seem useless in normal times become the difference between living and dying when the world ends. I had been cutting timber for 3 weeks straight in a remote section of the Mount Hood National Forest, about 200 miles northwest of Yellowstone. My cabin was so far from civilization that I had to drive 40 minutes just to get cell phone service. People always told me I lived too far from everyone else, that I was isolating myself from the world. My ex-wife Sarah used to complain that I chose trees over people, that I was running away from responsibility. She called me paranoid for keeping months of food stored in my cabin, for having backup generators and extra fuel. She said I was preparing for disasters that would never come. By day 6 of the apocalypse, I realized that distance from civilization and my so-called paranoia were the only reasons I'm still breathing today. The morning of June 15th started like any other day. I woke up at 5:30 in the morning, made coffee with water from my well, and planned to spend the day cutting down a section of diseased pine trees that the Forest Service had marked for removal. The coffee was still brewing when the earthquake hit. I'm not talking about a little tremor that rattles your windows. This was the kind of earthquake that makes you think a freight train is about to crash through your walls. The entire cabin shook so violently that my coffee mug bounced right off the kitchen table and shattered on the floor. Dishes fell out of my cabinets, and I could hear my tools crashing around in the shed outside. I stumbled outside in my work clothes, looking around to figure out what was causing the shaking. The forest was completely silent, except for the groaning of trees, swaying back and forth. Then I looked southeast toward Wyoming, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a massive black column rising from the horizon, so tall it disappeared into the clouds. Even from 200 miles away, that ash plume looked like the earth itself was bleeding into the sky. I had seen pictures of volcanic eruptions before, but nothing prepared me for the sheer size of what I was looking at. This wasn't just a volcano erupting. This was something that was going to change everything. I ran back inside and turned on my battery-powered radio, frantically searching through the static for any news stations that were still broadcasting. Finally, I found an emergency broadcast from Portland. This is an emergency alert. Yellowstone National Park has experienced a catastrophic volcanic eruption. A massive ash cloud is spreading rapidly across the northwestern United States. All residents are advised to seek immediate shelter indoors. Do not go outside without respiratory protection. Emergency services are responding to the situation. This is not a test. My hands were shaking as I tried to call my ex-wife in Portland. Emma and Jake, my 2 kids, were staying with her for the summer, and they were right in the path of that ash cloud. The phone lines were jammed. Every call went straight to a busy signal. I kept trying over and over, but I couldn't get through to anyone. That busy signal should have told me everything I needed to know about what was happening in the cities, but I was too focused on reaching my children to understand the bigger picture. By noon, the sky had turned this eerie orange-brown color, like looking through dirty amber. The air itself felt thick and heavy. Then the ash started falling. At first, it looked like gray snow drifting down from the clouds. But this wasn't snow. This ash was hot and gritty, and when you breathed it in, it burned your throat and made your eyes water. I had to cover my face with a wet cloth just to walk from my cabin to my truck. I tried to drive toward Portland to get to my kids. But my truck started coughing and sputtering after just a few miles. The ash was getting sucked into the engine, clogging the air filter and choking the life out of it. I barely made it back to my cabin before the engine died completely. That truck had never failed me before, but it couldn't handle breathing volcanic ash any more than I could. I was stranded, cut off from my children when they needed me most. The temperature started dropping that first day. June in Oregon is usually warm and pleasant, with temperatures in the 70s. But by evening, my thermometer read 55 degrees. I thought it was just the ash blocking out the sun, that things would get back to normal once the cloud passed. I had no idea that the sun wouldn't shine again for months, and that 55 degrees would feel tropical compared to what was coming. The second day was when I realized this wasn't going to be a temporary problem. The ash kept falling heavier and heavier, coating everything in a layer of gray powder that got thicker by the hour. My cabin looked like it had been buried in concrete dust. But worse than the ash was the cold. The temperature had dropped to 45 degrees, and it was still falling. In June, in Oregon, this wasn't natural weather. This was the beginning of something that would kill more people than any war in human history. I kept trying to call Emma and Jake, but the phone lines were getting worse. When I did manage to get through to a Portland number, all I heard were busy signals or recordings, saying that all circuits were busy. The few times I reached an actual person, they would tell me that the roads were blocked, that people were being evacuated from the city, and that I needed to stay where I was. Stay where I was. As if I had a choice with my truck dead in ash, falling like the world was ending. The radio stations started going off the air one by one. First, the music stations disappeared. Then the talk radio shows went silent. By the third day, only a few emergency broadcast stations were still operating, and they were playing the same recorded messages over and over. Seek shelter, conserve food, avoid going outside, help is coming. But no help was coming. The government couldn't help millions of people when their own infrastructure was collapsing under the weight of volcanic ash and plummeting temperatures. On the third day, the temperature hit 38 degrees. 38 degrees in the middle of June. I had to start a fire in my wood stove just to keep from shivering inside my own cabin. I began to understand that this wasn't going to be over in a few days. This was the new reality, and I needed to start thinking about long-term survival instead of waiting for rescue. That's when I took inventory of my supplies for the first time. Sarah always made fun of me for keeping so much food stored in my cabin. She said I was preparing for disasters that would never happen, that I was wasting money on canned goods and rice that would just sit there and expire. But as I counted my supplies on day 3, I realized I had enough food for maybe 6 weeks if I was careful about rationing. I had propane for my backup stove, batteries for my radio and flashlights, and enough firewood to last through a normal winter. I didn't know then that this winter would be anything but normal. The fourth day brought the first real emergency broadcasts that told the truth about what was happening. A crackling AM station from Seattle reported that major highways were blocked by abandoned vehicles, that grocery stores had been looted, and that people were fighting over the last supplies of food and fuel. The government evacuation centers were overwhelmed within hours, with thousands of people showing up, but only enough resources for hundreds. They mentioned that refugee camps were being set up in state parks and fairgrounds, places with open space where they could handle large numbers of people. I didn't know then that I'd be desperately searching for one of those camps by the end of the month. The power started going out intermittently on day 4. First, it would flicker off for a few minutes, then come back on. Then it would stay off for an hour at a time. The power company was fighting a losing battle against volcanic ash that was getting into everything, shorting out transformers and bringing down power lines. I switched to my battery-powered radio and started conserving the fuel in my backup generator. I had maybe 50 gallons of gasoline stored in my shed, but I knew it wouldn't last forever. Day 5 was when I heard the last coherent news broadcast about what was happening in the cities. A reporter in Portland, speaking over crackling static, described scenes that sounded like something from a disaster movie. Thousands of cars abandoned on the highways as people tried to flee the city on foot. Fires burning out of control because the fire department couldn't respond to every emergency. Grocery stores, with their windows smashed and their shelves completely empty. People wearing makeshift masks and goggles, struggling to breathe in air thick with volcanic ash. The reporter's voice was getting hoarse, and you could hear her coughing between sentences. Then the transmission cut out, and I never heard from that station again. That night, the temperature dropped to 32 degrees, freezing, in June. I had to drain the water from my outdoor spigots to keep the pipes from bursting. Inside my cabin, I could see my breath when I woke up in the morning. I was burning through my firewood faster than I had planned, but I didn't have a choice. Without heat, I would freeze to death in my own home during what should have been the warmest month of the year. The 6th day started with complete silence. No radio stations were broadcasting. No emergency alerts. No crackling voices telling me that help was on the way. Just static on every frequency. The power had been out for 12 hours straight, and it wasn't coming back on. The phone lines were completely dead. I couldn't even get a dial tone. For the first time since the eruption, I was completely cut off from the outside world. I had no way of knowing what was happening beyond my cabin, no way of contacting my children, and no way of calling for help if something went wrong. That's when I saw the first snowflake. It was just after noon on June 21st, the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the day when the sun should have been shining brightest and warmest. Instead, I watched a single snowflake drift down from the gray sky and land on my cabin porch. Then another one. Then another. Within an hour, snow was falling steadily, covering the ash-coated ground with a layer of white that should have been impossible in the middle of summer. I stood on my porch watching the snow fall, and that's when the full reality of the situation hit me. This wasn't a temporary disaster that would be over in a few weeks. The volcanic ash had blocked out so much sunlight that the planet was cooling down faster than anyone had thought possible. We weren't just dealing with a volcanic eruption. We were witnessing the beginning of an ice age, and it was happening in real time instead of over thousands of years like the scientists always said it would. I went back inside and looked at my supply inventory again, but this time I was calculating for months instead of weeks. If the temperature kept dropping like this, if the snow kept falling, if the sun stayed blocked out by volcanic ash, then I was looking at a winter that might last for years. My 6 weeks of food suddenly seemed like nothing. My 50 gallons of gasoline wouldn't last through a single month of running my generator. My firewood, which had seemed like plenty for any emergency, might not be enough to keep me alive until spring. If spring ever came again. That evening, I made my first attempt at rationing. Instead of eating a normal dinner, I opened 1 can of soup and made it last for both lunch and dinner. I turned off all the lights except for one battery-powered lantern, and I let the fire in my wood stove burn down to just enough to keep the cabin above freezing. I was already starting to change how I lived, starting to think like someone who might need to make their supplies last for months instead of days. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the wind howling outside and the snow tapping against my windows, I kept thinking about Emma and Jake, My daughter Emma was 12 years old, smart and independent, but she had never experienced anything like this. My son Jake was only 9, still at the age where he believed his parents could fix any problem. They were somewhere in Portland, or maybe they had been evacuated to one of those refugee camps I heard about on the radio. Were they warm? Did they have enough food? Did they understand that their father was trapped 200 miles away, unable to reach them? I made a promise to myself that night. No matter how bad things got, no matter how long this ice age lasted, I was going to survive long enough to find my children. I was going to use every skill I had learned as a lumberjack, every piece of survival knowledge I had picked up over the years, and every supply I had stored in my cabin to stay alive until I could get to Portland and bring Emma and Jake to safety. I didn't know then that this promise would be tested in ways I couldn't imagine, that I would be pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance, and that the journey to find my children would be more dangerous than anything I had ever faced in my life. By day 6, the snow was 3 inches deep and still falling. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, 4 degrees below freezing, on what should have been one of the warmest days of the year. My cabin was the only light visible in any direction. Every other house, every other cabin, every sign of human civilization had either been abandoned or had lost power. I was alone in a world that was freezing to death, with nothing but my supplies, my skills, and my determination to see my children again. When I saw that first snowflake fall on June 21st, the longest day of the year, I knew the old world was over. But I had no idea how much worse it was about to get. Day 7 started with me waking up to 6 inches of snow covering everything outside my cabin. 6 inches of snow in late June. The thermometer outside my kitchen window read 28 degrees, 4 degrees below freezing on what should have been one of the warmest mornings of the year. I could see my breath inside my own cabin, even with the wood stove burning through the night. The world had turned upside down in less than a week, and I was beginning to understand that this new reality wasn't going to end anytime soon. My heating system was struggling badly. The wood stove that had always kept my cabin comfortable during normal Oregon winters was working overtime now, burning through my firewood supply faster than I had ever seen. But the real problem wasn't the cold outside. It was the volcanic ash that had been falling for 6 days straight. That fine, gritty ash was getting into everything, including the air intake for my wood stove. Every time I opened the damper to get more airflow, ash would get sucked in and start clogging the system. The stove would burn dirty, producing less heat and more smoke, and I was constantly having to clean out the ash buildup just to keep it working. I spent most of day 7 trying to modify my heating system to deal with the ash contamination. Using materials I had around the cabin, I created makeshift air filters by cutting up old work shirts and layering them over the air intakes. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it helped reduce the amount of ash getting into the stove. I thought fixing the heating was my biggest problem. I didn't realize that in just a few days, I'd be burning my grandmother's antique furniture just to survive one more night. The temperature kept dropping throughout the day. By noon, it was down to 25 degrees. By evening, it had hit 22 degrees. This wasn't just unseasonable cold. This was the kind of temperature that kills exposed skin in minutes. And it was happening in the middle of summer. I had to start thinking about my clothing differently. My normal work clothes weren't designed for this kind of cold. I layered everything I had, wearing thermal underwear under my regular clothes, then adding my heaviest winter coat on top. Even inside my cabin, I was dressed like I was going ice fishing in January. Day 8 brought a harsh reality about my food supplies. I had been rationing carefully since day 3, but I was still going through my stored food faster than I had calculated. The cold was making me hungrier than usual. My body was burning more calories just trying to stay warm, and I found myself wanting to eat more food to generate internal heat. I sat down with a pencil and paper and did the math again. If I continued eating at my current rate, I had maybe 3 weeks of food left. If I cut my daily calories even more, I might stretch it to 4 weeks. But 4 weeks of what? 4 weeks of waiting for rescue that wasn't coming? 4 weeks of hoping the temperature would somehow go back to normal? I started melting snow for water on day 8 because my pipes had frozen solid. The well pump was still working, but the pipes leading from the well to my cabin had frozen overnight, and I couldn't get them thawed out. Melting snow was a time-consuming process that required a lot of fuel for my stove, but I didn't have a choice. I needed water to survive, and snow was the only source I had. I filled every pot and container I owned with snow, then melted it down batch by batch. It took all morning to get enough water for one day, and I realized I was going to have to do this every single day until the pipes thawed, if they ever thawed. The silence outside was getting to me more than I wanted to admit. Before the eruption, I could always hear something. Cars on the distant highway, airplanes overhead, the sound of other people living their lives, even if they were miles away. But now there was nothing. No traffic, no aircraft, no sounds of civilization at all. Just the wind blowing through the trees and the constant whisper of falling ash and snow. The world had gone quiet in a way that made me feel like I was the only person left alive on the planet. Day 9 was when I started to understand how quickly people had fled the area. I decided to check on my nearest neighbor, an old man named Henderson who lived about half a mile through the woods. Henderson was tougher than leather, a retired logger who had survived everything the Oregon wilderness could throw at him. If anyone was going to stick it out and weather this disaster, it would be him. But when I made the difficult trek through the snow to his cabin, I found his front door standing wide open, snow blowing into his living room. Henderson's cabin was completely abandoned. It looked like he had left in a hurry, taking only what he could carry and leaving everything else behind. His cupboards were still half full of food. His closets still had clothes hanging in them, and there was a half-finished cup of coffee sitting on his kitchen table, now frozen solid. Finding Henderson's place empty should have been a warning. To me, he was tougher than I was, more experienced at surviving in harsh conditions, and if he had decided to run, maybe I should have been running too. But I couldn't run. My truck was dead, killed by volcanic ash on the first day. I was trapped in my cabin until I could either fix the truck or find another way to travel. And even if I could travel, where would I go? The radio broadcasts before, they stopped and talked about refugee camps, but they also talked about those camps being overwhelmed and running out of supplies. At least in my cabin, I had some food, some heat, and some shelter. Out on the road, I would have nothing but what I could carry on my back. I took some of Henderson's abandoned supplies back to my cabin. It felt like stealing, but Henderson was gone, and those supplies would just rot or freeze if I left them there. I found a few cans of food, some batteries for my radio, and a propane camping stove with several fuel canisters. The extra food bought me maybe 3 more days, and the propane stove would let me cook without using my main wood stove, saving precious firewood. I felt guilty taking Henderson's things, but I told myself that if the situation were reversed, he would have done the same thing. Day 10 brought the first real test of my shelter. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees, colder than many Oregon winter nights, and the snow was now 18 inches deep with no sign of letting up. My cabin roof was making sounds I had never heard before, creaking and groaning under the weight of all that snow. I had built this cabin to handle normal Oregon weather, but normal Oregon weather didn't include 18 inches of snow in June and temperatures 15 degrees below normal winter lows. I spent most of day 10 reinforcing my roof from the inside, using spare lumber I had stored in my shed to create additional support beams. It was dangerous work, climbing up into the rafters while the roof was already stressed, but I didn't have a choice. If the roof collapsed, I would be exposed to the elements with no shelter at all, and that would be a death sentence in these conditions. The roof was groaning like it was in pain, and I kept thinking about what would happen if it collapsed. I didn't know that in less than 2 weeks, that roof would be the only thing between me and certain death. The wind picked up on day 11, turning the falling snow into a blinding blizzard that made it impossible to see more than a few feet outside my windows. The wind chill was brutal, dropping the effective temperature to well below zero. I could hear the wind howling around my cabin like a living thing, trying to find every crack and gap it could use to get inside. The walls of my cabin, which had always felt solid and secure, were shaking with each gust of wind. I had never experienced weather this severe, and I was starting to worry that my cabin wasn't built to handle it. I was burning through my firewood supply much faster than I had planned. The constant wind was sucking heat out of my cabin faster than my wood stove could replace it, forcing me to keep the fire burning hotter and longer than usual. I calculated that at my current rate of wood consumption, I would run out of firewood in about 2 weeks. After that, I would have to start burning furniture, books, anything combustible I could find in my cabin. I looked around at my grandmother's antique rocking chair, my handmade dining table, the bookshelves my father had built for me when I first moved into the cabin. All of it might have to become fuel if I wanted to survive. Day 12 was when I had my first major rationing crisis. I opened my pantry to get my daily ration of food and realized I had been miscounting my supplies. I didn't have 3 weeks of food left. I had maybe 10 days if I was extremely careful about portions. The stress of the situation had been affecting my judgment, making me eat slightly larger portions than I had planned, and those small mistakes were adding up to a potentially fatal miscalculation. I sat down and recalculated everything from scratch. 1 can of soup per day, split between lunch and dinner. 1 cup of rice every other day. 1 piece of bread per day when I had bread, nothing when I didn't. Water only when I was thirsty, not whenever I wanted a drink. By cutting my daily calorie intake to barely above starvation levels, I could make my food last maybe 2 weeks. But 2 weeks of eating almost nothing while burning extra calories to stay warm was going to leave me weak and vulnerable at exactly the time when I needed to be strong. The temperature hit 12 degrees on day 12, the coldest it had been yet. 12 degrees below zero wind chill with the howling wind that wouldn't stop. I was burning furniture now, starting with an old wooden chair that I had never liked anyway. The chair burned hot and fast, providing good heat for a few hours, but I knew I couldn't sustain this for long. I only had so much furniture, and once it was gone, I would have to start burning the structural elements of my cabin itself. That night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps in the snow outside my cabin. Not the random sounds of snow falling from tree branches or the wind blowing debris around. Actual footsteps, deliberate and purposeful, circling my cabin in the darkness. Someone was out there in the blizzard, walking around my cabin at midnight in 12-degree weather. Someone who was either incredibly well-equipped for survival or incredibly desperate. I grabbed my axe and listened carefully to the footsteps. They made a complete circle around my cabin, pausing at each window as if whoever was out there was looking inside, trying to see what I had or how well defended I was. Then they made another circle, moving more slowly this time, stopping for longer periods at each window. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there and what they wanted, but something told me to stay quiet. In a world where everyone was dead or dying, where food and shelter were the difference between life and death, a stranger circling your cabin in the middle of the night might not have good intentions. The footsteps stopped at my front door and stayed there for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. I could hear someone breathing heavily just outside my door, probably exhausted from walking through deep snow in sub-zero temperatures. Part of me wanted to open the door and help whoever it was, But another part of me remembered Henderson's abandoned cabin and wondered if this person had something to do with his disappearance. Finally, the footsteps moved away from my door and continued around the cabin one more time before disappearing into the forest. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, axe in hand, listening for any sign that the person was coming back. When morning came, I went outside to investigate and found the footprints clearly visible in the snow. The prints circled my cabin 3 times, just like I had heard. Someone had been watching me for hours, studying my cabin, maybe planning something. In a world where everyone was dead or dying, I couldn't decide if having another person nearby was good news or the worst. News possible. Day 13 brought more footprints, but these were different. Instead of circling my cabin, these prints came straight up to my front door, then led away toward the main road. There was something deliberate about these prints, something that suggested the person wasn't just wandering randomly, but had a specific purpose in mind. I followed the prints as far as I could, but they disappeared where the snow had been blown around by the wind. I spent day 13 reinforcing my doors and windows with spare lumber, turning my cabin into something more like a fortress than a home. I nailed boards across the windows, leaving just small gaps I could see through, and I reinforced my front door with a heavy wooden bar that would make it almost impossible to break down from the outside. I thought I was protecting myself from thieves or desperate people who might want to take my supplies. I didn't realize I was actually keeping out someone who might save my life. The paranoia was getting to me more than I wanted to admit. Every sound outside made me reach for my axe. Every gust of wind that rattled my windows made me think someone was trying to break in. I was starting to understand why people went crazy during long sieges or extended periods of isolation. The human mind isn't designed to handle this level of stress and uncertainty for weeks at a time. I was sleeping poorly, eating barely anything, and constantly looking over my shoulder for threats that might or might not be real. Day 14 started with another set of footprints, but this time there was something different. Tucked under a rock near my front door, I found a piece of paper with a message written in pencil. Please help. Family trapped in car 2 miles. South on Forest Road 12, running out of food and heat. Please. I stared at that note for a long time, trying to decide what to do. Helping strangers would mean using my supplies to keep more people alive, which would reduce my own chances of survival. But leaving a family to freeze to death in their car wasn't something I could live with either. The note had changed everything. I thought helping them would be charity, an act of kindness that might cost me my life. I didn't know they had information that would keep me alive through the worst week of my life. I made the decision to investigate. I couldn't live with myself if I ignored a family in need, especially if there were children involved. I packed my axe, some rope, and a small amount of food, then set out through the snow toward Forest Road 12. The trek was brutal, with snow up to my waist in some places and wind that cut through my layers of clothing like they were made of paper. But I pressed on, following the rough direction the note had indicated. 2 miles felt like 20 miles. In those conditions, the snow was so deep that I was essentially swimming through it rather than walking, and the cold was so intense that I had to stop every few hundred yards to warm my hands and feet before they went completely numb. I was beginning to wonder if this was a trap, if someone was luring me away from my cabin so they could break in and steal my supplies. But I had come too far to turn back now. That's when I found them. A small sedan buried up to its windows. In snow, engine dead, windows fogged with the breath of the people trapped inside. I could see movement through the fogged glass, and when I knocked on the window, a woman's face appeared, pale and desperate and filled with relief at seeing another human being. There were 4 of them crammed into that car. A woman named Sarah, her husband Tom, and their 2 children. A teenage girl named Lisa and a younger boy named Ben. They had been trapped in that car for 3 days, running the engine intermittently to stay warm until the battery died and left them with no heat at all. They were refugees from Portland, trying to drive to relatives in California when their car got stuck in the blizzard. Sarah told me about what had happened in the city, about the riots and the fires and the evacuation centers that ran out of food within hours of opening. She described scenes of chaos that made my isolated cabin seem like paradise by comparison. Thousands of people fighting over dwindling supplies, government officials abandoning their posts, and entire neighborhoods being evacuated as the infrastructure collapsed under the weight of the disaster. But it was Tom who told me something that would prove crucial to my survival. As we dug their car out of the snow and I helped them gather their belongings, he mentioned an abandoned ranger station about 5 miles east of my cabin. He said it was supposed to have emergency supplies cached there for situations exactly like this one. Food, medical supplies, maybe even radio equipment for communicating with other survivor groups. When Tom mentioned that ranger station, I acted like it wasn't important information. But it was the most important thing anyone had ever told me, and it would soon mean the difference between life and death. I brought the family back to my cabin, knowing that it would strain my resources to the breaking point, but unable to leave them to freeze in their car. 4 extra people meant my food supplies would be gone in less than a week instead of 2 weeks. It meant my heating fuel would run out faster, my water supplies would be depleted quicker, and my small cabin would be overcrowded and uncomfortable. But it also meant I wouldn't be alone anymore, and after nearly 2 weeks of isolation, having other people around felt like a gift, even if it came with enormous challenges. Sarah and her family shared everything they knew about what was happening in the outside world. They told me about survivor groups forming in rural areas, about government evacuation centers that had been overwhelmed and abandoned, and about the growing understanding that this wasn't a temporary disaster, but the beginning of a new ice age that could last for years. They had been listening to emergency radio broadcasts right up until their car died, and they had information about other survivors that I desperately needed. But it was young Ben, Sarah's 10-year-old son, who taught me something that would save my life in the days to come. He had learned from a YouTube video, back when the internet still worked, how to use snow as insulation for walls and windows. He showed me how to pack snow between my cabin walls and a tarp stretched across the outside, creating an insulating barrier that could keep interior temperatures significantly warmer. That trick, learned by a kid from a video he had watched before the world ended, would keep me alive when the big storm hit and everything went wrong. Day 15 was spent sharing resources and information with my new housemates. We pooled our supplies and recalculated how long everything would last with 5 people instead of 1. The answer was sobering. We had maybe 4 days of food if we rationed strictly, and the heating fuel would last perhaps a week if we kept the cabin just warm enough to prevent freezing. But we also had more knowledge, more skills, and more people to share the work of survival. Tom told me more details about the ranger station, including rough directions for how to find it and what kinds of supplies might be stored there. Lisa, despite being only 16, had been paying attention during her family's journey from Portland, and could provide information about road conditions and other survivor groups they had encountered. Sarah had medical training as a nurse and could help if anyone got sick or injured. Even young Ben contributed with his knowledge of improvised survival techniques he had learned from internet videos. By the end of day 15, we had made a plan. Tom and I would attempt to reach the ranger station and retrieve whatever supplies we could find. Sarah and the kids would stay at the cabin, conserving heat and rationing the remaining food. If we found significant supplies at the ranger station, we could potentially survive for several more weeks. If we didn't find anything, we would all be dead within days. As I prepared for the journey to the ranger station, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the eruption began. Hope. For the first time in 2 weeks, I had a plan that might actually work, allies who could help me execute it, and a destination that might contain the resources we needed to survive. I thought helping this family was an act of charity that might cost me my life. Instead, they had given me information and assistance that might actually save it. But I also felt the weight of responsibility that came with having other people depend on me. It was no longer just about my own survival. 4 other people, including 2 children, were counting on me to find supplies and bring them back safely. The stakes had never been higher, and I was about to venture out into a frozen wasteland that had already killed most of the people who had tried to cross it. That night, as we all huddled together in my small cabin, sharing body heat and the last of my firewood, Sarah told me something that changed my perspective on everything. She said that most of the people who had died in the cities weren't killed by the cold or the ash. They were killed by panic, by poor decisions made in desperation, by giving up hope when things seemed impossible. The people who survived were the ones who stayed calm, made smart decisions, and refused to quit even when everything seemed hopeless. As I lay in my sleeping bag that night, listening to the wind howling outside and feeling the warmth of other human beings nearby for the first time in weeks, I realized that I had already survived the hardest part of this disaster. I had made it through 2 weeks of complete isolation, sub-zero temperatures, and dwindling supplies. I had kept my sanity, maintained my health, and even managed to help other people who needed assistance. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I had already proven to myself that I could handle them. But I also knew that the real test was still coming. The journey to the ranger station would be dangerous, and there was no guarantee that we would find what we needed when we got there. The weather was getting worse instead of better, and our supplies were running out faster than we had hoped. We were about to find out if hope and determination were enough to keep us alive, or if the ice age that had already killed millions of people would claim us as well. The family was asleep around me, trusting me to keep them safe and find the supplies we needed to survive. Tomorrow, Tom and I would set out into a frozen wasteland in search of salvation. Tonight, for the first time since the world ended, I wasn't alone. Day 16 changed everything about how I viewed other people in this new world. I woke up that morning thinking I was protecting myself and my supplies from potential thieves or desperate survivors who might want to take what little I had left. The family sleeping in my cabin had already told me they were grateful for my help, but I was still paranoid about trusting anyone completely. After 2 weeks of complete isolation, part of me wondered if having other people around was making me more vulnerable instead of safer. That morning, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow around my cabin again. These weren't from Tom or any of the family members. These were different prints, larger and deeper, suggesting someone heavier moving around my property during the night. The prints circled my cabin twice, just like the mysterious visitor from a few nights before, but this time they came much closer to the windows. Whoever was out there had been bold enough to approach my cabin, even with 5 people inside instead of just one. I followed the footprints as far as I could, but they led into the dense forest where the snow had drifted too deep for me to track effectively. Sarah noticed my concern and asked what was wrong. When I told her about the mysterious visitor who had been watching my cabin, she got a worried look on her face. She said that during their journey from Portland, they had encountered other survivors who weren't looking for help or cooperation. Some people had turned desperate enough to take supplies by force from anyone they thought was weaker than them. Tom suggested that we post watches during the night, taking turns staying awake to listen for anyone approaching the cabin. It was a good idea, but it also meant we would all be getting less sleep at a time when we needed to conserve our energy for the journey to the ranger station. I spent all day barricading myself further into the cabin, adding more boards to the windows and reinforcing the door with additional lumber. I thought I was protecting myself from thieves. I didn't realize I was actually keeping out someone who might save my life. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees that day, the coldest it had been since the eruption started. 8 degrees with a wind chill that made it feel like 20 below zero. We were burning through my firewood at an alarming rate just to keep the cabin warm enough to prevent frostbite. Young Ben's snow insulation technique was helping, but it wasn't enough to offset the brutal cold that seemed to get worse every day instead of better. Day 17 brought our first real crisis with the family. We had been rationing food strictly, but Lisa, the 16-year-old daughter, was struggling with the constant hunger. She had been used to eating regular meals before the eruption, and the stress of being trapped in a freezing car for 3 days followed by severe rationing was taking a toll on her both physically and emotionally. She started arguing with her parents about the food distribution, claiming that she needed more calories because she was still growing. Sarah had to explain to her daughter that we were all slowly starving, that there wasn't enough food for anyone to eat as much as they wanted, and that complaining about it wouldn't create more supplies. It was a harsh conversation to witness, watching parents tell their child that they couldn't provide enough food to keep her from being hungry. But it was also a reminder of how quickly civilized behavior breaks down when people are facing life or death situations. That evening, we heard voices outside the cabin. Not footsteps this time, but actual human voices speaking in low tones somewhere in the forest around my property. Tom and I grabbed our improvised weapons, my axe and a heavy piece of firewood that Tom could use as a club, and we listened carefully to try to determine how many people were out there and what they might want. The voices moved around the perimeter of my property for about an hour, never coming close enough for us to make out individual words, but clearly engaged in some kind of discussion or planning. At one point, we heard what sounded like an argument between two men, voices raised just enough for us to catch fragments of words like supplies and how many and wait. Then the voices moved away into the forest, and we didn't hear them again that night. We all stayed awake until dawn, taking turns watching the windows and listening for any sounds that might indicate the people were coming back. Sarah kept her children close to her, and I could see the fear in her eyes as she realized that we might be dealing with people who viewed us as targets rather than potential allies. The world had become a place where encountering other humans could be as dangerous as facing the elements. Day 18 was when I made the decision that would define the next phase of our survival. We were down to less than 2 days of food, even with strict rationing, and the temperature showed no signs of improving. If we stayed in the cabin and waited for rescue or for conditions to improve, we would all be dead within a week. If we attempted to reach the ranger station that Tom had told me about, we might find enough supplies to last several more weeks, or we might die in the attempt. I gathered everyone together and laid out our options as clearly as I could. We could stay in the cabin and slowly starve while hoping that help would somehow arrive. Or we could make the dangerous journey to the ranger station in search of emergency supplies. Tom volunteered to come with me, leaving Sarah and the children in the relative safety of the cabin. It was a risky plan, but it was the only plan that offered any hope of long-term survival. Sarah gave us detailed directions to the ranger station based on what Tom remembered from their journey and what she could recall from maps she had seen before the eruption. The station was approximately 5 miles east of my cabin, but those 5 miles would have to be covered on foot through waist-deep snow in sub-zero temperatures. If we pushed hard, we could make it there in 1 day, spend the night at the station, and return the next day with whatever supplies we could carry. That evening, as Tom and I prepared our gear for the journey, Sarah pulled me aside and told me something that I wouldn't fully understand until later. She said that during their escape from Portland, they had encountered several groups of survivors who were heading toward established camps or gathering points. Some of these groups had mentioned a large survivor settlement forming at Silver Falls State Park, about 50 miles south of where we were. If we could find enough supplies to make the journey, we might be able to reach a place where hundreds of people were working together to survive the Ice Age. I filed that information away for later consideration. Silver Falls was too far to reach with our current supplies and the children in tow. But if we could find significant resources at the ranger station, it might become a viable destination. The idea of joining a larger group of survivors was appealing after weeks of isolation and uncertainty. But first, we had to survive the next few days and find the supplies we needed to make any long-term plans possible. Day 19 was departure day for our mission to the ranger station. Tom and I set out before dawn, hoping to reach the station by afternoon and have time to search for supplies before dark. We each carried a backpack with basic survival gear, some rope, my axe, and the last of our drinking water. Sarah and the children stayed in the cabin with instructions to keep the fire burning low but steady, conserve the remaining food, and not open the door for anyone except Tom and me. The journey was brutal from the first step. The snow was deeper than we had expected, often reaching above our waists and requiring us to essentially swim through it rather than walk. The temperature was hovering around 5 degrees with a wind that cut through our layers of clothing like ice knives. Every step required enormous effort, and we had to stop frequently to rest and prevent our core body temperatures from dropping dangerously low. After 2 hours of struggling through the snow, we encountered our first major obstacle. A section of forest where several large trees had fallen across our path, creating a barrier that was impossible to climb over or go around. The trees were covered in ice and snow, making them treacherous to navigate, but we had no choice. We had to find a way through if we wanted to reach the ranger station. Tom suggested that we try to tunnel under one of the fallen trees, digging through the snow that had accumulated beneath it. It was exhausting work that required us to take turns digging while the other person rested and watched for signs of hypothermia or frostbite. The digging took over an hour, precious time that we couldn't afford to lose. But eventually we created a passage large enough for both of us to crawl through with our packs. By noon, we had covered less than half the distance to the ranger station, and both of us were showing signs of serious fatigue. Tom was moving more slowly than when we started, and I could see that he was struggling to maintain his body heat despite all his layers of clothing. We found a partially sheltered spot behind a large boulder and stopped to rest and eat some of our limited food supplies. During our rest stop, Tom told me more about what had happened in Portland during the first few days after the eruption. He described scenes that sounded like something from the end of the world. Government officials abandoning their posts as the infrastructure collapsed, police officers leaving their duties to take care of their own families, and entire city blocks being evacuated as people realized that urban areas couldn't support large populations without electricity, heat, and regular food deliveries. He also told me about the government evacuation centers that had been set up in schools and community centers around the city. These centers were supposed to provide food, shelter, and medical care for displaced residents, but they were overwhelmed within hours of opening. Thousands of people showed up, but the centers only had supplies for hundreds. The situation deteriorated rapidly as hungry, cold, and frightened people fought over dwindling resources. The most disturbing thing Tom told me was about the mortality rate in the evacuation centers. People were dying from exposure, malnutrition, and lack of medical care at a rate that shocked even the emergency responders who were trying to help. Children and elderly people were particularly vulnerable, and many families were making the desperate decision to leave the centers and try to survive on their own rather than watch their loved ones slowly waste away in overcrowded, undersupplied facilities. As we resumed our journey toward the ranger station, I kept thinking about what Tom had told me about the evacuation centers. Thousands of people gathering together for safety, only to discover that safety was an illusion when there weren't enough resources to go around. It made me wonder if our plan to reach Silver Falls State Park and join a larger survivor group was actually a good idea, or if we would just be walking into another desperate situation where too many people were competing for too few supplies. The afternoon portion of our journey was even more challenging than the morning had been. The temperature dropped to near zero, and the wind picked up to the point where it was difficult to maintain our direction. We were navigating by compass and landmark, but the blowing snow made it hard to see more than a few dozen yards in any direction. I started to worry that we might become lost in the wilderness, wandering in circles until we collapsed from exhaustion and froze to death. Tom was struggling more visibly now, moving slowly and stopping frequently to catch his breath. I could see that he was burning through his energy reserves faster than I was, probably because he wasn't as accustomed to the kind of physical exertion that came naturally to me after years of working as a lumberjack. But he kept pushing forward without complaining, determined to reach the ranger station and find the supplies his family needed to survive. Late in the afternoon, just as I was beginning to wonder if we had missed the ranger station entirely, we spotted a building through the trees ahead of us. It was a small single-story structure with a metal roof and wooden walls, partially buried in snow but clearly man-made. We had found the ranger station, but as we got closer I could see that we weren't the first people to discover it. The front door of the ranger station was standing open, and there were footprints in the snow leading in and out of the building. Someone had been here recently, and they had left the door open when they departed. Tom and I approached cautiously, not knowing if the building was currently occupied or if whoever had been here before might return while we were inside. The interior of the ranger station showed clear signs of having been searched and partially looted. Cabinets were open, drawers had been pulled out and emptied, and there was debris scattered across the floor. But as we searched more thoroughly, we discovered that whoever had been here before hadn't found everything. There was a hidden storage room behind a false wall, accessible through a panel that looked like part of the regular wall construction. Inside the hidden storage room, we found exactly what we had been hoping for: emergency food supplies including canned goods, dried foods, and water purification tablets. Basic medical supplies including bandages, antiseptic, and pain medication. Most importantly, we found radio equipment that appeared to be in working condition, along with emergency batteries and a manual for operating the system. Tom and I loaded our backpacks with as many supplies as we could carry, focusing on the most calorie-dense foods and the most essential medical items. The radio equipment was too heavy and complex for us to transport back to my cabin, but I memorized the operating instructions and made note of the emergency frequencies that were listed in the manual. If we could return to the ranger station with better transportation or more people, we might be able to establish radio contact with other survivor groups. As we prepared to leave the ranger station, Tom discovered something else that would prove crucial to our survival. Tucked behind some boxes in the storage room, he found a detailed topographical map of the entire region, including marked locations of other emergency supply caches, ranger stations, and potential shelter sites. The map also showed the location of Silver Falls State Park and several possible routes for reaching it safely. We spent our last few minutes at the ranger station, studying the map and planning potential routes to Silver Falls. The distance was approximately 50 miles through mountainous terrain, but the map showed several intermediate waypoints where we might be able to resupply or find shelter. It would be a dangerous journey, especially with Sarah's children, but it was beginning to look like our best option for long-term survival. The return journey to my cabin was faster than the trip to the ranger station, partly because we were following our own tracks through the snow, and partly because we were motivated by the knowledge that Sarah and the children were waiting for us with dwindling supplies. But it was also more dangerous because we were carrying heavy packs, and both of us were exhausted from the day's exertion. About halfway back to the cabin, we encountered evidence that we were being watched. Fresh footprints in the snow, crossing our trail and heading in the direction of my cabin. The footprints were larger than any made by our group, and they were recent enough that whoever made them might still be in the area. Tom and I picked up our pace, worried about what we might find when we reached the cabin. We arrived at my cabin just as the sun was setting and everything appeared normal from the outside. Smoke was rising from the chimney, indicating that Sarah was keeping the fire going as we had instructed. But when I called out to announce our return, there was no immediate response from inside the cabin. Tom and I approached cautiously, weapons ready, not knowing what we might encounter. Finally, Sarah's voice came from inside the cabin, asking us to identify ourselves before she would open the door. When we did, she let us in quickly and immediately barricaded the door behind us. She told us that someone had been watching the cabin for most of the day, staying just at the edge of the tree line where they could observe the building but remain mostly hidden. She had seen movement in the forest several times, but never got a clear look at whoever was out there. Lisa and Ben were visibly relieved to see us return safely, and their faces lit up when they saw the supplies we had brought back from the ranger station. We had enough food to last all 5 of us for at least 10 days, maybe 2 weeks if we continued rationing carefully. More importantly, we now had a map and a plan for reaching a larger survivor settlement where we might find long-term safety and community. As we shared our evening meal, the first substantial food any of us had eaten in days, I told the family about everything we had discovered at the ranger station. The emergency supplies, the radio equipment, the map showing routes to Silver Falls State Park, and the evidence that other survivors were actively moving through the region and searching for resources. Sarah listened carefully to every detail, asking questions about distances, travel times, and the challenges we would face in making the journey with her children. That night, as we planned our next moves and discussed the possibility of leaving my cabin to join the survivor settlement at Silver Falls, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the eruption. Hope for the future that extended beyond just surviving the next few days. We had supplies, we had information, and we had a destination where hundreds of other people were working together to rebuild some form of civilization in this frozen world. But I also felt the weight of the decision we were facing. My cabin had kept us alive through the worst of the initial disaster, but it was becoming clear that staying here indefinitely wasn't a viable long-term strategy. The supplies would eventually run out, the cold showed no signs of improving, and we were too isolated to benefit from the cooperation and resource sharing that a larger group could provide. The question was whether the dangerous journey to Silver Falls was worth the risk, especially with children in our group. As I lay in my sleeping bag that night, listening to the wind howling outside and feeling the warmth of the extra food in my stomach, I thought about how much had changed since I first heard those mysterious footsteps circling my cabin. The person or people who had been watching us were still out there, but now we knew we weren't the only survivors in the region. There were others like us, struggling to stay alive and searching for resources and safety in a world that had become hostile to human life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new decisions about our future. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, we had enough food to go to sleep without hunger, enough information to make informed plans, and enough hope to believe that we might actually survive this disaster and find our way to a place where we could rebuild our lives. The ranger station had given us more than just supplies. It had given us a future to work toward and the knowledge that we weren't alone in this frozen wasteland that used to be our home. Day 20 started with the harsh realization that our supplies from the ranger station, while life-saving in the short term, wouldn't last nearly as long as we had hoped. With 5 people eating regularly for the first time in weeks, we were going through the food much faster than my earlier calculations had predicted. I sat down with the topographical map Tom and I had found and tried to figure out if we could make it to Silver Falls State Park before our supplies ran out completely, The math was sobering. We had enough food for maybe 10 days if we rationed strictly. The journey to Silver Falls would take at least a week through deep snow with 2 children, assuming we didn't encounter any major obstacles or weather delays. Sarah and I spent most of the morning discussing our options, while Tom played simple games with the children to keep their spirits up. We could stay at my cabin and try to make our supplies last as long as possible, hoping that rescue would eventually come or that the weather would improve enough for us to forage for additional food. But after nearly 3 weeks of steadily worsening conditions, it seemed unlikely that help was coming or that the ice age would end anytime soon. Our other option was to attempt the dangerous journey to Silver Falls, where we might find an established community with better resources and long-term sustainability. The decision became urgent when we calculated exactly how much food we would need for the journey itself. If we packed enough supplies to feed 5 people for a week-long trek through the wilderness, we would have almost nothing left if we needed to turn back, or if the journey took longer than expected. It was a gamble that could cost us our lives, but staying in the cabin was starting to look like slow suicide by starvation. I packed my emergency supplies, thinking it would be a day trip to the ranger station. I had no idea I wouldn't see my cabin again for 6 days. Day 21 was when we made the final decision to leave my cabin and attempt to reach Silver Falls State Park. The choice was driven partly by our dwindling supplies and partly by increasing evidence that other people in the area were becoming desperate enough to pose a threat to our safety. We had seen fresh footprints around the cabin almost every day, and Sarah reported seeing movement in the tree line even during daylight hours. Someone was watching us constantly, and we didn't know if they were planning to ask for help or planning to take our supplies by force. We spent the day preparing for departure, packing only the most essential items and leaving behind anything that would slow us down or add unnecessary weight. I took my axe, some rope, basic tools, and the warmest clothing I owned. Sarah packed medical supplies and extra clothing for the children. Tom carried most of the food supplies and the detailed map we had found at the ranger station. Even Ben, young as he was, carried a small pack with his own clothes and some lightweight emergency items. The hardest part of leaving was abandoning the cabin that had kept me alive through the worst disaster in human history. This building had been my shelter, my fortress, and my sanctuary during 3 weeks of apocalyptic weather. I had reinforced its roof, modified its heating system, and turned it into a survival bunker that had protected not just me but 4 other people from freezing to death. Walking away from it felt like abandoning a friend who had saved my life. But I also knew that staying would eventually kill us all. The cabin was a temporary solution to an ongoing problem. We needed to find a community of survivors who could pool resources, share knowledge, and work together to build something sustainable in this new frozen world. My isolated cabin, no matter how well prepared, couldn't provide the long-term security that a group of hundreds of people working together could offer. We set out on the morning of day 22, following the route Tom and I had planned using the topographical map. The first part of the journey would take us back toward the ranger station, then south through a series of valleys that offered some protection from the wind. According to the map, there were several potential shelter sites along the way, including abandoned buildings and natural formations that could provide protection if we were caught in bad weather. The going was even more difficult than I had anticipated. Sarah and the children weren't accustomed to the kind of physical exertion required to travel through waist-deep snow for hours at a time. We had to stop frequently to rest and to make sure that no one was developing frostbite or hypothermia. Lisa, despite being 16, struggled with the cold more than the rest of us, and we had to constantly monitor her for signs that she needed additional warm clothing or a longer rest break. Every car I passed was a tomb. I stopped looking inside after the 3rd one. But one of those cars would become my shelter when everything went wrong. The abandoned vehicles we encountered along the way told the story of how quickly the disaster had overwhelmed people's ability to escape. Cars buried in snow with their doors open, suggesting that people had abandoned them and tried to continue on foot. Vehicles that had slid off the road and been left where they crashed, their occupants either rescued by others or claimed by the cold. Some of the cars contained supplies that their previous owners had been forced to leave behind. Blankets, food, tools, and other items that could be useful for our survival. I felt guilty taking things from these abandoned vehicles, but I also knew that the original owners were either dead or had moved on, and that these supplies could make the difference between our family surviving or perishing in the wilderness. By late afternoon on day 22, we were all showing signs of serious fatigue. Ben was having trouble keeping up despite his young energy, and Sarah was clearly concerned about how the exertion was affecting her children. We found shelter for the night in an abandoned gas station, a small building that provided protection from the wind and had enough space for all of us to sleep together for warmth. The gas station had been looted thoroughly, but we found some useful items that had been overlooked by previous scavengers. A few cans of motor oil that could be burned for heat in an emergency, some tools that might prove useful, and most importantly, a working flashlight with fresh batteries. The building also had a small office area with chairs and a desk that we could burn for fuel if necessary. That night, as we huddled together in the gas station office, Sarah told us more about what she had observed during their escape from Portland. She described seeing entire neighborhoods abandoned overnight, with houses left open and personal belongings scattered in the streets as people fled the city in panic. She talked about the breakdown of basic services like water, electricity, and garbage collection, and how quickly urban areas became unlivable when the infrastructure failed. But she also told us about acts of kindness and cooperation she had witnessed during the crisis. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers sharing food and shelter, and people organizing informal groups to pool resources and increase their chances of survival. These stories gave me hope that when we reached Silver Falls State Park, we would find a community of people working together rather than a desperate crowd fighting over limited supplies. Day 23 brought our first major crisis during the journey. We had been making good progress towards Silver Falls, following the route marked on our map and staying on schedule despite the challenging conditions. But around midday, the weather took a dramatic turn for the worse. The wind picked up to near blizzard conditions, and the temperature dropped to well below zero. Visibility became almost non-existent, and we were forced to stop moving and seek immediate shelter. The problem was that we were in an open area with no buildings or natural shelter nearby. According to the map, the nearest potential shelter was still several miles away, too far to reach safely in blizzard conditions. We were caught in the open during the worst weather we had experienced since leaving my cabin, and we needed to find protection immediately or risk freezing to death. Tom spotted an abandoned truck partially buried in snow about a quarter mile off our planned route. It wasn't ideal shelter, but it was better than staying exposed to the wind and blowing snow. We fought our way through the blizzard to reach the truck, and found that while it was damaged and obviously non-functional, the cab was intact and could provide protection for all 5 of us if we squeezed together. That truck saved my life that night. But when I saw the storm clouds building the next morning, I knew the real test hadn't even started yet. We spent 18 hours crammed into the cab of that abandoned truck, sharing body heat and taking turns staying awake to monitor everyone for signs of hypothermia. The blizzard raged outside with a fury that made my cabin's wood stove seem like a candle flame in comparison. The truck rocked back and forth in the wind, and at times I worried that it might actually be blown over, despite being partially buried in snow. Lisa had the hardest time during our night in the truck. She was claustrophobic from being squeezed into such a small space with 4 other people, and she was struggling with the constant cold that seemed to seep through every layer of clothing we had. Sarah did her best to keep her daughter calm and warm, but I could see the fear in both their eyes as the storm continued to rage with no sign of letting up. Ben handled the situation better than any of us had expected. Despite being the youngest member of our group, he seemed almost excited by the adventure of riding out a blizzard in an abandoned truck. He told jokes and stories to keep everyone's spirits up, and he shared techniques he remembered from survival videos about staying warm in confined spaces. That kid's positive attitude and practical knowledge were helping to keep our entire group from panicking. When dawn finally came on day 24, the blizzard had passed but left us in a dramatically changed landscape. The snow was now more than 3 feet deep in most places, with drifts that were taller than the children. Our planned route to Silver Falls was completely obscured, and some of the landmarks we had been using for navigation were buried under snow. We were going to have to navigate by compass and hope that we could stay on course without being able to see familiar terrain. Features. Worse than the navigation challenges was the realization that the blizzard had cost us almost a full day of travel time. We were now behind schedule on a journey where timing was critical for our survival. Our food supplies were calculated for a specific number of days, and every delay brought us closer to the point where we would run out of provisions before reaching our destination. But the most alarming discovery came when we tried to resume our journey towards Silver Falls. Tom, who had been carrying most of our food supplies, realized that his backpack had been damaged during the night in the truck. The zipper had broken, and several containers of food had fallen out and been lost in the snow around the vehicle. We spent an hour searching for the missing supplies, but the blizzard had buried everything under several feet of fresh snow. We now had maybe 4 days of food left for 5 people, and we were still at least 3 days away from Silver Falls under good conditions. With the deep snow and difficult terrain we were facing, the journey would probably take longer than 3 days, which meant we would likely run out of food before reaching our destination. For the first time since leaving my cabin, I began to seriously doubt whether we had made the right decision. Sarah suggested that we turn back and try to return to my cabin, where we at least had a known shelter and the possibility of finding more supplies. But Tom pointed out that we had already used up most of our provisions for the outbound journey, and we didn't have enough food left to make it back to the cabin, even if we turned around immediately. We were committed to reaching Silver Falls, whether we wanted to be or not. The afternoon of day 24 was when I discovered something that would change our entire strategy for the remainder of the journey. While searching the area around the abandoned truck for our lost food supplies, I found evidence of a recent campsite. Someone had built a small fire in a sheltered spot near the truck, probably during the same blizzard that had trapped us. The ashes were still warm, indicating that whoever had been there was probably less than a day ahead of us. More importantly, the campsite showed signs of being used by a larger group of people. There were footprints from at least 6 different individuals, and the amount of debris suggested that they had spent several hours at the location. Tom found some discarded food packaging that indicated this group had significantly better supplies than we did. They were clearly experienced travelers who knew how to move efficiently through the winter landscape. I made the decision to try to follow this group rather than continuing with our original route to Silver Falls. The footprints and other signs suggested that they were heading in roughly the same direction we were, and they obviously had better knowledge of how to survive and travel in these conditions. If we could catch up with them, we might be able to join their group or at least benefit from their experience and potentially better supplies. Sarah was hesitant about following strangers through the wilderness, especially with her children in tow. She pointed out that we didn't know anything about this group's intentions or whether they would welcome additional members. But Tom argued that we were already in a desperate situation, and that following experienced survivors was probably our best chance of reaching safety before our food ran out completely. The decision was made for us when Ben spotted smoke rising from a location about 2 miles ahead of us. Someone was maintaining a fire during daylight hours, which suggested either a permanent camp or a rest stop for travelers. Either way, it meant that other people were in the immediate area, and we needed to make contact with them if we wanted to improve our chances of survival. We approached the smoke source cautiously, not knowing whether we would encounter friendly survivors or desperate people who might view us as competition for limited resources. Tom and I took the lead, with Sarah and the children staying back until we could assess the situation. As we got closer, we could see that the fire was being maintained at what appeared to be another abandoned building, possibly a small ranger outpost or maintenance facility. The building was occupied by a group of 7 adults and 3 children, all of whom appeared to be in better condition than our group despite having been traveling through the same harsh conditions. They had more supplies, better cold weather, gear, and a more organized approach to wilderness survival than we had managed to develop. When we approached their camp, they were initially suspicious, but became more welcoming when they saw that we had children with us. The leader of this group was a man named Rodriguez who had been a park ranger before the eruption. He had extensive knowledge of the regional geography and had been guiding his group towards Silver Falls, using routes and techniques that were far more efficient than our amateur navigation efforts. He told us that Silver Falls State Park was indeed being used as a major survivor settlement, with several hundred people already established there and more arriving every day. But Rodriguez also gave us information that changed our understanding of what we would find at Silver Falls. He said that the settlement was struggling with overcrowding and resource shortages, that new arrivals were often turned away if they couldn't contribute significant skills or supplies to the community. The days of welcoming everyone who showed up were over, and the settlement was becoming increasingly selective about who they allowed to join their group. This news was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it confirmed that Silver Falls was a viable destination with a large, organized community of survivors. Terrifying because it meant that our journey might be for nothing if we were deemed unfit for membership in the settlement. Rodriguez's group had valuable skills and well-organized supplies, which would make them attractive to the Silver Falls community. Our group consisted of a lumberjack, a nurse, a maintenance worker, and 2 children, which might not be as appealing to people who were trying to build a sustainable community. Rodriguez offered to let us travel with his group for the remainder of the journey to Silver Falls. He said that having additional adults would be helpful for security and labor, and that traveling together would be safer for everyone involved. But he also made it clear that once we reached Silver Falls, we would be on our own in terms of gaining acceptance into the community. He couldn't guarantee that his endorsement would be enough to secure our admission to the settlement. Despite the uncertainty about our ultimate reception at Silver Falls, joining Rodriguez's group immediately improved our chances of surviving the journey. They had enough food to share with us for several days. They knew efficient routes that would cut at least a day off our travel time, and they had experience with the kind of challenges we were likely to face in the remaining distance to our destination. That evening, as we camped with Rodriguez's group in the abandoned building, I reflected on how much our situation had changed since leaving my cabin just 3 days earlier. We had gone from being an isolated family group struggling to survive on our own to being part of a larger community of travelers with better resources and knowledge. But we had also learned that the world we were trying to reach might not welcome us as easily as we had hoped. The children were excited about having other kids to talk to and play with. Their first social interaction with peers since the eruption began. Lisa and Ben quickly made friends with the children in Rodriguez's group, and for the first time in weeks, I heard genuine laughter and saw smiles that weren't forced or desperate. Sarah was relieved to have other adults to share the responsibility of keeping everyone safe and healthy during the journey. As I lay in my sleeping bag that night, surrounded by more people than I had seen together since the world ended, I thought about the promises I had made to myself during those long, isolated nights in my cabin. I had sworn that I would survive long enough to find my children Emma and Jake, who were somewhere in the chaos that Portland had become. But joining this group and heading towards Silver Falls was taking me further away from Portland, not closer to it. Rodriguez had told us that communications with other survivor settlements were limited, but that Silver Falls had radio contact with several other communities in Oregon and Washington. If I could reach Silver Falls and gain acceptance into their community, I might be able to get information about other settlements, including any that might have been established in the Portland area. It was a slim hope, but it was better than trying to search for Emma and Jake on my own in a frozen wasteland that had already killed most of the people who had tried to cross it. Tomorrow we would continue towards Silver Falls with a larger group, better supplies, and more knowledge about what awaited us there. But we would also be facing the final test of whether we could find acceptance in a community that was becoming increasingly selective about who deserved to survive in their new world. The journey that had started as an escape from starvation had become a quest for belonging in a society that might not want us. The road ahead was still dangerous, our ultimate destination was still uncertain, and we were still carrying the weight of decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for everyone in our group. But for the first time since leaving my cabin, I felt like we were moving toward something better rather than just running away from something worse. Day 25 brought the final phase of our journey to Silver Falls, but it also brought the worst weather we had experienced since leaving my cabin. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero, and the wind was howling so fiercely that it was difficult to hear each other speak even when we were walking side by side. Rodriguez's group had better cold weather gear than we did, but even they were struggling with the brutal conditions that seemed to get worse with each passing hour. We were making slower progress than Rodriguez had planned because of the children in both groups. Ben was doing remarkably well for a 10-year-old, but he was still moving more slowly than the adults, and we had to take frequent breaks to make sure he wasn't developing frostbite or hypothermia. Lisa was having an even harder time, and Sarah was constantly checking on her daughter to make sure she was staying warm and keeping up with the group. Around noon, Rodriguez called a halt and gathered all the adults together for a serious discussion about our situation. He told us that according to his calculations, we were still about 8 miles from Silver Falls, which meant at least another full day of travel in these conditions. But the weather was deteriorating so rapidly that he was concerned about our ability to keep moving safely, especially with the children. Rodriguez had identified a potential shelter site about 2 miles ahead of our current position, an abandoned ski lodge that should provide protection from the wind and space for our entire group to rest safely. He suggested that we push hard to reach the lodge, spend the night there, and then make the final push to Silver Falls the following day. It would add another day to our journey, but it would also reduce the risk of losing someone to the extreme cold. As we struggled through the deep snow toward the ski lodge, I kept thinking about the promise I had made to myself about surviving long enough to find Emma and Jake. Here I was, 25 days after the eruption, still alive and getting closer to a community where I might be able to get information about other survivor settlements. But every step I took away from Portland felt like I was abandoning my children, even though I knew that trying to search for them on my own would be suicide. The ski lodge turned out to be partially damaged, with sections of the roof collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, but there were still areas that provided adequate shelter for our group. Rodriguez's people were experienced at setting up temporary camps, and they quickly organized sleeping areas, established a cooking area, and posted guards to watch for potential threats during the night. That evening, as we shared a meal using combined supplies from both groups, Rodriguez told us more about what we could expect when we reached Silver Falls. The settlement had been established by a group of park rangers and emergency responders who had coordinated the evacuation of several smaller communities in the first days after the eruption. They had chosen Silver Falls because it offered natural shelter, access to water, and existing infrastructure that could be adapted for a large group of survivors. But Rodriguez also warned us that the settlement was facing serious challenges that were testing the limits of their organization and resources. Food production was minimal because of the frozen ground and lack of sunlight for growing crops. Heating fuel was in short supply, and they were burning furniture and wooden structures to keep people warm. Medical supplies were running low, and they had lost several people to preventable illnesses and injuries. Most concerning was Rodriguez's description of the social dynamics at Silver Falls. The original leadership group was still in control, but there were growing tensions between different factions of survivors who had different ideas about how the community should be organized and who should be allowed to join. Some people wanted to accept any survivor who showed up, while others believed that the settlement needed to be selective to avoid overwhelming their limited resources. Rodriguez told us that our best chance of being accepted at Silver Falls was to demonstrate that we had valuable skills or resources that the community needed. Sarah's medical background as a nurse would definitely be welcomed, and my experience as a lumberjack could be useful for construction and maintenance projects. Tom's mechanical skills might also be valuable, especially if the settlement was trying to repair vehicles or equipment. But the children would be viewed as a burden rather than an asset, at least initially. This information forced me to confront a reality I'd been avoiding since we left my cabin. The world had changed so dramatically that even children were now viewed primarily in terms of their resource consumption rather than their inherent value as human beings. Communities that might have once welcomed families with open arms were now making calculations about whether additional mouths to feed were worth the potential contributions of additional hands to work. Day 26 started with devastating news that changed everything about our situation. During the night, the roof of the ski lodge had continued to deteriorate under the weight of snow and wind, and a large section had collapsed into the area where Rodriguez's group had been sleeping. 2 adults were injured, 1 seriously, and a significant amount of their supplies had been buried or damaged in the collapse. The injured man was Rodriguez's second-in-command, a former firefighter named Martinez who had been instrumental in planning their route to Silver Falls. He had a serious head injury and a broken leg that would make it impossible for him to continue the journey. Rodriguez was faced with an impossible choice: stay with Martinez and risk everyone else dying from exposure and starvation, or leave him behind and continue to Silver Falls with the rest of the group. Sarah immediately took charge of treating Martinez's injuries using the medical supplies we had brought from the ranger station. She was able to stabilize his head injury and improvise a splint for his broken leg, but she told Rodriguez honestly that Martinez needed proper medical care that was only available at an established settlement like Silver Falls. Staying at the ski lodge would likely mean death for Martinez and possibly for the rest of us as well. Rodriguez made the decision that Martinez would have to be carried to Silver Falls on an improvised stretcher, even though this would slow our progress significantly and require several people to take turns as stretcher bearers. It was a decision that demonstrated the kind of leadership and community values that had helped his group survive when so many others had perished. No one would be left behind, regardless of the additional risk and difficulty it created for everyone else. I thought saving half the cabin was a victory. I didn't realize the worst cold snap was still coming. The collapsed roof at the ski lodge was a harsh reminder of how the weight of snow and ice could destroy structures that seemed solid and safe. It made me think about my own cabin, which I had reinforced with spare lumber, but which might not be able to withstand a full winter of accumulated snow. I wondered if the cabin that had kept me alive for the first 3 weeks after the eruption was still standing, or if it had already succumbed to the same forces that had destroyed the ski lodge. The final day of our journey to Silver Falls was the most challenging yet. We were carrying an injured man on a stretcher through deep snow and sub-zero temperatures, with limited food supplies and growing concern about whether we would be accepted into the settlement when we finally arrived. The children were exhausted and cold. The adults were pushed to their physical limits, and everyone was running on determination rather than energy. But it was also the day when I learned the most about human resilience and the power of community cooperation. Everyone in our combined group took turns carrying the stretcher, sharing the burden so that no one person became too exhausted to continue. The children helped by carrying lighter items and encouraging the adults when spirits started to flag. Sarah provided constant medical monitoring of Martinez, while also keeping watch over her own children and anyone else who showed signs of hypothermia or frostbite. Around midday, we crested a ridge and saw our destination in the valley below us. Silver Falls State Park had been transformed into something that looked like a small city, with dozens of temporary structures, smoke rising from multiple fires, and people moving around between buildings in what appeared to be organized activity. It was the first sign of large-scale human civilization any of us had seen since the eruption began, and the sight brought tears to the eyes of several members of our group. But as we got closer to the settlement, we also became aware of how well-organized and potentially defensive the community had become. There were guards posted at multiple points around the perimeter, and we could see that the main approaches to the settlement were controlled through checkpoints where new arrivals were being questioned and evaluated. This wasn't a refugee camp, where anyone could walk in and receive automatic assistance. This was a functioning community that was protecting itself and its resources from outsiders who might pose a threat. The guards who met us at the first checkpoint were polite but thorough in their questioning. They wanted to know where we had come from, what skills and resources we were bringing to the community, and whether we had been in contact with any hostile groups during our journey. Rodriguez's reputation as a former park ranger helped establish our credibility, but I could see that the guards were making mental notes about everything we told them. Sarah's medical background immediately attracted attention from the guards. They told us that the settlement's medical staff was overwhelmed with cases of frostbite, hypothermia, malnutrition, and injuries from accidents and fights. A trained nurse would be welcomed enthusiastically by the community leadership. My skills as a lumberjack were also viewed favorably, as the settlement was constantly working on construction and repair projects to improve their shelter and infrastructure. But I could also see the guards' concern when they realized our group included 3 children. Children required food, medical care, and supervision while contributing little to the community's survival efforts. The guards didn't say anything directly, but their expressions made it clear that families with children were less likely to be granted full membership in the settlement than groups consisting entirely of working-age adults. The evaluation process took several hours as we were interviewed by different members of the settlement's leadership council. We were asked detailed questions about our backgrounds, our journey to Silver Falls, and our expectations for life in the community. We were also given a tour of the settlement facilities so we could understand the living conditions and work requirements that would be expected of community members. What I saw during that tour was both impressive and sobering. The settlement had successfully organized several hundred people into a functioning community with organized work details, shared meals, medical care, and security patrols. They had established workshops for equipment repair, food preparation areas, and even a school for the children who were already part of the community. It was proof that human civilization could be rebuilt even under the most challenging circumstances. But I also saw signs of the strain that the community was under. People looked thin and tired, suggesting that food supplies were limited even for established community members. The medical facility was overcrowded with patients suffering from cold-related injuries and illnesses. The housing consisted mostly of tents and improvised shelters that provided minimal protection from the elements. Everyone was working constantly just to maintain basic survival, with little energy left over for improving their situation. The final decision about our acceptance into the community came late in the afternoon. Rodriguez and his original group members were welcomed immediately based on his reputation and their obvious experience and skills. Sarah was also accepted quickly because of the urgent need for medical personnel. Tom's mechanical background earned him provisional acceptance, pending a demonstration of his abilities. The decision about me and the children was more complicated. The Leadership Council recognized that my lumberjack skills could be valuable, but they were concerned about accepting 3 additional children when the community was already struggling to feed and care for the children they had. They offered me individual membership in the community, but suggested that I might want to consider whether bringing the children into such a resource-constrained environment was in their best interest. This was the moment when I had to make the most difficult decision of my entire survival journey. I could accept membership in the community for myself, gaining access to food, shelter, medical care, and the security of being part of an organized group. But doing so would mean abandoning Lisa and Ben, the children who had become like family to me during our weeks together, and potentially condemning them to death in the wilderness. Sarah solved the dilemma by making an offer to the Leadership Council. She proposed that her entire family, including me as an honorary member, be accepted as a single unit. She argued that I had proven my commitment to the children's welfare during our journey, and that splitting up families would undermine the community values that made Silver Falls worth preserving. She also pointed out that the children had demonstrated resilience and adaptability that suggested they would become productive community members as they grew older. The council agreed to accept all of us on a provisional basis, with the understanding that we would be evaluated after a trial period to determine whether we were contributing enough to justify our continued membership. It wasn't the unconditional welcome we had hoped for, but it was an opportunity to prove ourselves and build a new life in a community of survivors who were working together to rebuild civilization. As we were assigned temporary housing and introduced to the daily routines of community life, I reflected on how much had changed since that morning 26 days ago. When I woke up to the sound of the Yellowstone eruption, I had gone from being an isolated lumberjack living alone in a remote cabin to being a member of a community of hundreds of people who were working together to survive the end of the world as we knew it. But I also knew that reaching Silver Falls was just the beginning of a new phase of survival rather than the end of our struggles. The community was facing enormous challenges that would test everyone's resilience and commitment. Food production, medical care, security, and social cohesion were all ongoing problems that required constant attention and cooperation from every community member. Most importantly, I still hadn't given up on my original goal of finding Emma and Jake. The settlement had radio contact with other survivor communities, and I was determined to use those communications to search for information about my children. They were still out there somewhere, probably in another settlement like Silver Falls, and I wasn't going to rest until I found them or learned what had happened to them. That evening, as I sat around a communal fire sharing a meal with dozens of other survivors, I thought about the letter I had written to Emma and Jake during one of the darkest moments in my cabin. I had written that letter thinking it might be my last words to them, but now I had hoped that it wouldn't be necessary. I had survived 30 days of the worst disaster in human history, and I had found a community where I could continue working toward the goal of reuniting my family. The radio equipment at Silver Falls was more sophisticated than anything I had seen at the ranger station. The next morning, I would begin the process of trying to contact other settlements and searching for any information about survivors from the Portland area. It was possible that Emma and Jake were in another community like Silver Falls, waiting for their father to find them just as I had been waiting for an opportunity to search for them. I thought surviving 30 days was impossible. The community leader just told me we've got at least 30 months of this ahead of us. And somewhere in that frozen wasteland that used to be Portland, my children are waiting for their father to find them. The Ice Age wasn't ending anytime soon, but I had proven to myself that I could adapt and survive in this new world. I had found allies, developed new skills, and discovered reserves of strength and determination that I didn't know I possessed. The first 30 days had been about learning to survive as an individual in a world that had become hostile to human life. The next phase would be about learning to thrive as part of a community, while continuing to search for the family members who gave my survival meaning and purpose. The worst might be behind us, but the real work of rebuilding civilization and reuniting families was just beginning. Emma and Jake were still out there, and I was going to find them no matter how long it took or how many obstacles I had to overcome. The fire was warm, the food was nourishing, and I was surrounded by people who understood what it meant to survive when everything familiar had been destroyed. For the first time since the morning, the mountains screamed and changed everything. I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be to take the next step in my journey toward finding my children and rebuilding my life in this frozen new world.